Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 39. The First Roman Sultan. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we introduced the land of Anatolia, and we covered the very first permanent migrations of Turks to that land. The land that is destined to be the homeland of the Turks. As we discussed, the Turkish invasions and migrations were not centrally planned or directed. They were bottom-up affairs, with small bands of Turks moving onto the Anatolian plateau as the Roman state evaporated over much of Anatolia. There the tribes began to graze their herds and raid the settlements of the region, with some bands of Turks beginning to offer those same settlements protection from their fellow Turks for a price. This effectively threw much of Anatolia into anarchy. And today, we're going to discuss how the very first Turkish political entities in Anatolia began to emerge out of that anarchy. Now, as we discussed, the Roman Empire had of course fallen into civil war after Manzikert. Out of this, Michael Ducas had become emperor. Constantinople had then tried to hold the east, but it was all to no avail. The campaigns of 1073 and 1074 demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Roman state was by now simply incapable of enforcing its writ on the plateau. And Emperor Michael was moreover primarily focused on events in the west, a Bulgarian revolt arising in the Balkans, and Norman knights on his doorstep. Additionally, modern historians like Anthony Caldelis think that Emperor Michael may have been fearful of sending a great army east. Perhaps a successful general would return to claim the throne himself. And thus, Anatolia was lost, or gained, depending on your perspective. Because it was in this environment, in the late 1070s and early 1080s, that the very first Turkish beyliks began to emerge in Anatolia. Now, as we discussed at the end of the last episode, the nuclei of these beyliks were essentially the leadership of local bands of Turks who began to make protection deals with the settled nobility. In essence, running mafia-style protection rackets that then began to evolve and entrench themselves. Now, the word beylik is of course derived from the word bey, an ancient Turkish title for commander that dates all the way back to the first and second khanates and now basically means Mr. in modern Turkish. Beyliks were small Turkish principalities, too small to warrant the title of Sultan, that emerged under the rule of a Turkish military commander or a bey. They would spring into existence as bands of Turks entered a region and began coalescing into a tribe around a ruling bey. They would then begin to establish political control over the area, not just taking tribute and protection money, but eventually beginning to actually administer the lands in question. And crucially, as we will come to see, this was accomplished less through conquest than it was through an alliance with the existing Byzantine nobility, administrative class, and what remained of the military. As always, when it comes to the nomads, the emergence of the beyliks was intimately connected to the role of the bey in intermediating the relationship between the settled world and the nomads. As we've seen ever since the very first episode of this podcast, this is really what gives nomad leaders their power. They are the men who can summon the tribes, but they are also the men the settled world recognizes and wants to deal with, which is what gives them power over the tribes. They are the liaison between the settled and nomadic worlds, which gives them power in both worlds. And so, in the late 1070s and early 1080s, Turkish beys began to set themselves up in the cities and fortresses of Anatolia, while in large part the tribes remained in the countryside, grazing their herds throughout the lands. And it is important to note that both Byzantine chroniclers and the archaeological evidence indicate that the Turks at this time were not really capable of sacking large castles or fortified cities. They simply lacked siege engines, organization, and even the numbers. Instead, they were mostly invited in by the existing elites, the nobles, and even what remained of the Roman military commanders. With retinues of their followers and the support of the young tribes coalescing around them, the beys would basically step into the role vacated by the now gone Roman soldiers and mercenaries. They provided protection to the cities and regions for a price, namely, the right to collect tribute or taxes and graze their herds. In these cities, the Turks soon came to essentially form a military elite, which, if you think about it, is very similar to what happened in the Great Seljuk Empire, the existence of the Turks as a separate military caste. Think back to our episode on the armies in the Great Seljuk Empire, the soldier, the asker, as a distinct class of person from the civilians, the raya, or the herds. Also similar was their payment in taxes and tribute, an echo of the ikta system that the Turks would have been intimately familiar with in the lands of the Great Seljuk Empire. And on the Roman side, there were also precedents. Remember that even prior to Manzikert, imperial authority had become quite frayed in most of eastern Anatolia. Instead of Roman garrisons, the empire had begun to rely on Latin, Norman, and Pecheneg mercenaries, and the Pechenegs were of course a Turkic people. From the perspective of a Byzantine noble in Anatolia, what was the real difference between paying protection money to a barbarian knight from Western Europe, a barbarian Pecheneg Turk, or a barbarian Oghuz Turk? It's all much of a muchness. So the Turks slotted in easily. They moved into the cities, taking up the role formerly played by the soldiers and mercenaries, in essence, becoming the military. And thus, in the cities of Anatolia, an urban Turkish political world came into existence, led by the beys and dominated by a military soldier caste of Turks. And for the most powerful of these beys, eventually, this will also mean importing into Anatolia the trappings of the Seljuk civilization they had come from, the religion of Islam, the Turkish language, and, in time, grafting on top of the existing Roman state structures the trappings of the court culture of the Great Seljuk Empire, divans, viziers, cadis, and so on. Coupled with this came the post hoc justification that we've seen in the sources. The insistence that these conquests were ordained and commanded by the great Seljuk Sultan and were blessed by God. And a part of this legitimation was presenting themselves as Ghazi holy warriors, men prosecuting the jihad. This allowed the beys to legitimate their conquests, not as the result of a bunch of rampaging Turkish tribes who barely knew what Islam was and indeed came to power through cooperation with local Christians, but rather as a divinely ordained holy war against the infidel, a jihad directed and commanded by the great Seljuk Sultan. And it is this fiction, this propaganda, that comes down to us in the Islamic sources, though as we have seen, it is exactly that, fiction and propaganda. Indeed, the formation of these political entities, these beyliks, was in fact sort of the opposite of jihad. This wasn't Ghazi holy warriors defeating the infidel, but rather pragmatic Turkish warlords partnering with the infidel. The states were formed not through conquest, but through cooperation with the existing Byzantine elites. Most importantly, going forward, it would be this new Turkish urban world that would, during the centuries to come, lead to the Turkification of Anatolia. Anatolia did not become Turkish through mass migration of Turkmen tribes. Indeed, genetic studies of modern Turks reveal the vast majority of Turks have at most trace amounts of Central Asian genetic ancestry. Instead, Turkification was a cultural process driven in these cities. The urban Roman world learning the Turkish language to deal with their military overlords, before eventually converting to Islam and speaking the language of their conquerors as their native language. In time, these native Anatolians would come to conceive of themselves as Turks. One of the very few times in history that steppe nomads managed to transmit their language and cultural identity to the people they ruled, instead of vice versa. Indeed, ultimately, Anatolia will not be so much conquered by the Turks as it will be converted by them. But we'll get into that in more detail as time goes on. So now, we're going to jump into the very earliest emergence of these beyliks, including the greatest of them all, a polity that would transcend beylik status and become a sultanate, the Sultanate of Rum, meaning, of course, the Sultanate of Rome. Now, the first beylik to emerge was actually the Nawakiya beylik that we covered in our episodes on the Great Seljuks. But the Nawakiya ruled in Syria and the Levant. The first truly Anatolian beylik to emerge was almost certainly the beylik founded by a man named Mengucek, the Menguç in Turkish. Mengucek was a Turkish tribal leader, probably one with close ties to the Seljuk dynasty itself. According to modern historians, he and his small band of Turks likely settled in the fortress city of Kemah near Erzincan in 1080. From there, he and his descendants would expand their power and control over the neighboring districts, ultimately taking over Erzincan itself, as well as a vast swath of eastern Anatolia. In time, the Mengucekids will become one of the most important beyliks in Anatolia, alternatively allied with and in conflict with the Sultanate of Rum. Another of the great Turkish beyliks, the Danishmand beylik, likely began to establish itself in a similar time frame. Now, the word Danishmand actually means teacher in Persian, because the founder of the beylik, the first bey, was a man named Gümüştegin Ahmad ibn Taylu Ali Danishmand, often simply called Danishmand Gazi. Gümüştegin was a Turkish aristocrat and close to the great Seljuk dynasty. But then, sometime in 1080, he appears to have fallen afoul of Nizam-ul-Mulk and al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, and was banished to Anatolia. Part of Nizam-ul-Mulk's consolidation of power and attempts to cut the Turkish aristocracy out of power. With his band of followers, he rode into Anatolia and began building a beylik in the central and northern part of Anatolia, just to the west of the Mengucekids. He quickly established himself in Sivas. The chronicler Michael the Syrian records, in that year, probably 1084 or 1085, a certain emir of the Turks called Danishmand invaded the province of Cappadocia, taking possession of Sivas, Kayseri, and other places in the northern region, and thus the rule of the house of Danishmand began. This is also confirmed by Ibn al-Athir, who writes that Gümüştegin became a ruler as Lord of Malatya, Sivas, and other places. Over the 1080s and the 1090s, the Danishmand beylik would spread out, taking much of central and northern Anatolia, most critically of all, including Ankara and the great city of Kayseri. And like the Mengucekid beylik, it would be at times an ally and at times an enemy of the Sultans of Rum. To the east of the Mengucekid beylik, in what is now the far east of modern Turkey, the Saltukid beylik likely also began to emerge in the late 1080s and early 1090s. founded by a Turkish chieftain of obscure origins, a man named Saltuk Bey. This beylik emerged in the city of Erzurum. However, the first definitive contemporaneous reference to Saltuk Bey only comes in 1103, so we are unfortunately a bit at a loss when it comes to the immediate post-Manzikert period. Similarly, we know basically nothing about a bey named Chawaldur, who Nishapuri mentions as ruling Marash in the far south of Anatolia on the slopes of the mountains leading down to Syria. To the south of the Saltukids and the Mengucekids, in the far southeast of modern-day Turkey, the Artukid beylik emerged, as we discussed in our episodes on the Great Seljuks. We, of course, saw Artuk in our last episode, capturing Roussel de Bayeux and ransoming him off before returning to the east. Later, he would lead an invasion of Basra in southern Iraq in 1086, and was then ultimately sent back north by the Seljuk court itself to act as a bulwark against the other Anatolian beyliks, and to bring into line the local Arab emirs. Here, he would come to establish his own beylik, and began encroaching into Anatolia from the south. Eventually, after the collapse of al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, his descendants would capture Malatya, Mardin, Midyat, and the other cities on the fringe of the Anatolian plateau. And as I've said before, the Artukid capital of Mardin and the nearby city of Midyat are the two best places in the world to see Seljuk architecture. But the heart of our story is not these smaller beyliks that began to emerge in the center and east of Anatolia, the Danishmands, the Mengucekids, the Saltukids, and the Artukids. Instead, it is with the Turkish polity that emerged in the west of Anatolia. No mere beylik, but a sultanate. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Rum is of course the Turkish word for Rome, and was used to refer to both the territories of the Roman Empire and the Greeks who formed the majority of its population. In modern Turkish, the word is used to refer to the Greek citizens of Turkey as opposed to the Greeks of nearby modern-day Greece. It is quite telling that this is the name the Turks gave to the Sultanate. And I think to begin the story of the Sultanate, we must start with the man who will found it. Sulayman ibn Kutalmish, the very first Roman Sultan. Sulayman ibn Kutalmish was the scion of a venerable Seljuk lineage. He had the bluest blood in Anatolia. His grandfather was Arslan Israel, the Lion of Israel, who had been the initial leader of the Seljuks after the death of Seljuk himself, the son of Seljuk who the founder of the dynasty had handed power over to. Arslan Israel, however, was then defeated by Mahmud of Ghazna in 1032, and leadership of the House of Seljuk passed to Chahri and Tuhrul, who of course went on to found the great Seljuk Empire. But Arslan Israel's son, Kutalmish, was of course still kicking around. No doubt furious that his cousins had gotten the better of him, he started cozying up with the wild tribes as Tuhrul built the great Seljuk Empire in the late 1030s and early 1040s. It was likely sometime in this period that Kutalmish's son Sulayman was born, based solely on sources referring to Sulayman as young in 1063. Tuhrul then decided that something had to be found for this resentful Seljuk prince before he did something stupid, and so he sent Kutalmish off to lead the Turkmen raids in Anatolia in 1045. Thus, Kutalmish first came to the lands that his descendants were destined to rule. Kutalmish appears to have hung around in the west of the empire, and at some point, Tuhrul appointed him as the governor of Azerbaijan and northern Iran. Kutalmish joined Tuhrul in his campaigns in Iraq, and appears to have remained loyal during Ibrahim Yanal's revolt in 1057 through 1059. But then, after Tuhrul's victory, as the childless Sultan aged, Kutalmish himself revolted. Tuhrul's attempts to put down his revolt were unsuccessful, and Kutalmish survived the great Sultan. Upon Tuhrul's death, Kutalmish attempted to seize the throne himself, but was ultimately defeated by his nephew Alp Arslan, dying after the Battle of Damaghan in 1063, as we covered in our earlier episodes. Now, we do not know the details of Sulayman's role in his father's career, but it does seem that he was old enough to have been a commander in his father's revolt and in the war against Alp Arslan. And it seems that after the defeat of his father Kutalmish, Sulayman was banished to the west. According to one source, the heroic lion reportedly wanted to kill the young prince, but was dissuaded in this by Nizam-ul-Mulk, and ultimately settled for getting him out of the lands of Iran. Nishapuri records, Alp Arslan wanted to kill everyone who belonged to him and his followers, and he ordered them to execute his young son Sulayman Shah, although he was young. Nizam-ul-Mulk, the vizier, did not consider this correct, and said killing them would be a mistake. Alp Arslan therefore sent them to the borders of the realm so that they would settle in the frontier region of Islam, and the insignia of the emirate and the royal rank would be taken from them. As a result, they would be held in contempt and misery. They appointed them to Diyarbakir and Ruha. Sulayman Shah is the father of the Sultans of Rum. And it is very interesting to note that this source, which is written from a pretty pro-Sulayman perspective, already is tying him to the ideology of jihad, portraying him from the start as a Ghazi warrior, a key part of the legitimation of the Sultans of Rum. Though as we will see, this was of course not really entirely accurate. Sulayman's dealings with the Christian Byzantines will hardly be the stuff that the legend of jihad is made of. Sulayman was thus packed off to the west by Alp Arslan, but he did not stay in Diyarbakir, being held in contempt and misery. As we discussed in an earlier episode, Sulayman would instead flee to the tribes and would become a leader of the great tribal confederation that coalesced in Syria, the Nawakiya. Now, we don't have very good sources on this period of his life for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we just don't have great sources on the Nawakiya and the wild tribes of Syria at all. This region, if you'll recall, was essentially at the corner of the three great empires and was sort of outside of imperial control. It was a zone of instability, and one into which the historians and the authors in the imperial centers couldn't really see. Additionally, all later historians know that Sulayman is going to become the Sultan of Rum, and so they sort of play him up, especially the partisans of the Sultanate of Rum, who are focused on legitimizing the dynasty. But the reality was that he was not the paramount leader of the Nawakiya, and so actual contemporary accounts don't really mention him. In fact, the only kind of contemporary verifiable reference to him in this period is from Vrdenios the Younger, who in a sort of offhand aside mentions two sons of Kutalmish, Mansur and Sulayman, and says that Mansur led a band of tribes in the region of the Taurus Mountains and Sulayman tribes in Syria. Indeed, it really seems that Sulayman originally was an equal leader of a band of Turkmen with his brother Mansur, and that Mansur was then later essentially airbrushed out of the picture by the Seljuk propaganda. That's basically all we know for sure about the 8 years between Damaghan and Manzikert. But this then starts to change after Manzikert, when Sulayman really enters the picture and comes into his own. Indeed, despite not fighting in the battle, Sulayman is the individual who benefited the most from it, because in the space created by his detested cousin's victory, Sulayman would manage to carve out a sultanate of his own in western Anatolia. Now, the fact that he was able to do this at all is actually quite surprising, and really shows his incredible talent. And as we will come to see, this talent was in many ways more political than martial. He was really more of a great politician than an amazing general. Now, this reality kind of flies in the face of modern Turkish popular history, which always paints Sulayman in absolutely grandiose terms. He is basically portrayed as the father of the Turkish nation in many ways. One famous Turkish historian, Halil Yananch, calls him the greatest and most respected father of the Anatolian Turks. Anadolu Türklerin en büyük ve en muhterem babası in Turkish. He is portrayed as a great military leader, intentionally planning out and directing a great conquest, a man who stands in the line of the other great Muslim and Turkish conquerors. This includes seeing him as a Ghazi leader, prosecuting the jihad, and as an official and appointed leader ordained by the great Seljuk Sultan. A view that was initially presented by the Sultanate of Rum's own partisan historians as a way to legitimize the Sultanate. But this view is emphatically not correct. Like the other beys, Sulayman was not actually a military commander ordered to conquer Anatolia as part of a grand design of the Seljuk court. He similarly wasn't prosecuting a great jihad to destroy the Christians. Indeed, far, far from it. And his actual story and his actual talents are indeed far more interesting than this chest-pumping propaganda. As is so often the case when it comes to nationalist propaganda, the truth is actually better than the fiction. Because as we will come to see, Sulayman was instead an audacious, an incredibly opportunistic and cunning political leader. He did not march into Anatolia at the head of grand armies, ordained by God and the great Seljuk Sultan to conquer the infidel, but instead built a state in Anatolia from the ground up. And he shrewdly played off the tribes, the local Byzantine population and nobility, the other beyliks, the court in Constantinople, and the court in Esfahan in order to build a state, become the foremost Turkish leader in Anatolia, and indeed maintain the independence of his fledgling sultanate from the great Seljuk court. In fact, I'd strongly argue that his greatest achievement wasn't even his conquests of the Romans. It was building a state and maintaining its independence from the great Seljuk Empire and al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. Far from being a loyal commander of a highly organized and planned invasion directed by Melik Shah from Esfahan, Sulayman was an audacious and entrepreneurial border lord, whose greatest enemy was in many ways the very Seljuk court the propaganda presents him as the servant of. And while his contemporary Atsuz was defeated and his beylik swallowed by the great Seljuk Empire, Sulayman's sultanate would instead endure and maintain its independence even after his own premature death. But at the same time, as we will come to see, Sulayman's own audacity, bordering on recklessness at times, the very audacity that enabled him to build a state from nothing, would ultimately come to undo him. Okay, so how did Sulayman begin his conquests and his state-building project? Unfortunately, again, we lack reliable sources. The historian Al-Azimi says in an aside that in the year 1075, Sulayman ibn Kutalmish conquered Nicaea, that is Iznik, and its territories. This is the date that many Turkish and Islamic historians stick to as the date of its conquest. But the Byzantine sources do not mention any meaningful Turkish presence in Iznik in this year, let alone its sack and capture, and they almost certainly would have had it actually occurred, given that Iznik is basically just a day's march from Constantinople itself. So I just don't think that this date makes sense, and indeed, it conflicts with other confirmed events within both the Byzantine and Islamic histories. All we can say for sure is that in the immediate aftermath of Manzikert, Sulayman and his brother Mansur led a band of Nawakiya Turkmen north through the passes and into Anatolia. And this raises another problem, one I kind of hinted at before: the question of Mansur. In the beginning, it is very clear from the contemporaneous Byzantine sources that the two brothers operated as an equal partnership. Of course, this later fell apart and Sulayman emerged on top, and we don't even really know Mansur's fate. But because of this, the later Islamic histories basically don't mention Mansur at all, being as they are written by pro-Sulayman authors. so we're sort of at a loss to really explain Mansur's role. Similarly, we don't have a good idea of the numbers of men led by the brothers, but based on circumstantial evidence, this seems like a comparatively large Seljuk band, a nascent tribe. But that said, we're still talking like maybe tens of thousands of warriors at most, not hundreds of thousands. Likely, they began raiding around Cappadocia at this time, and then began attracting more and more tribes to them. Then, in 1075, as we discussed in a prior episode, Sulayman and Mansur appear to have received a request for aid by Shöklü Bey, a lord of the Nawakiya beylik in the Levant. Shöklü Bey had gotten into a spat with Atsız, the ruler of the Nawakiya beylik, and had called upon Sulayman, asking for aid. He wrote, "You are a sultan who was a member of the House of Seljuk, and we would be proud and honored to obey you and find ourselves in your service, for the Emir Atsız is not of the House of Seljuk, and for this reason we cannot obey him." Sulayman then, in one of the episodes of recklessness that would pop up throughout his career, appears to have ridden south to try to take control of the Levantine Nawakiya beylik, or at least ordered a force south. Incidentally, this is yet another reason that 1075 doesn't really make sense for the fall of Iznik. How could Sulayman and his men be in both Syria and in Iznik in the same campaign season? But of course, this Anatolian force was defeated by Atsız, and Shöklü Bey was executed. Fleeing back north from this Levantine misadventure, Sulayman and his men then appear to have decided to move further into Anatolia. Indeed, I think Sulayman was quite lucky that this failure against Atsız did not doom him. Steppe leaders have lost their thrones and their heads for far less. Once back in Anatolia in 1075, Sulayman, Mansur, and their tribe appear to have resumed raiding around Cappadocia, even traveling far to the west to attack the great city of Laodicea on the very western edge of the Anatolian plateau. Certainly, they seem to have participated in the general marauding around Anatolia being undertaken by virtually all of the Turkish bands. Indeed, most of Anatolia itself had fallen into anarchy, as we have discussed. But it is apparent from the Byzantine sources that this tribe of Kutalmish did not stay in these regions, and instead decamped from central and western Anatolia to the far northwest of the plateau. This likely occurred sometime in 1076. There, they entered into the area of Bithynia, the area around Iznik and Eskişehir, and just on the other side of the mountains from Constantinople, at the very gates of the New Rome. Here, it seems likely that Sulayman and Mansur came to a deal with the local nobility of Iznik to provide protection for the region, as indeed was happening across Anatolia. Though it does seem that they did not actually enter the city of Iznik itself at this point. This would sort of set the template for Sulayman's rise, because he's going to become a sultan through, in essence, marrying to his great lineage an ability to cannily work with the Roman elites and play Byzantine politics. And Bithynia, a mere day's ride away from Constantinople, was the perfect base for such a man. Here, his powerful tribe of steppe warriors happened to be ideally placed to play Byzantine politics. They were not just the protectors of Iznik and its environs, but they could be key allies to any Byzantine general or emperor who needed military muscle. And a great opportunity soon presented itself. In October 1077, the great Byzantine general Nikephoros Votaniates revolted against the sitting emperor Michael Doukas. Votaniates had been the strategos of the Anatolian theme and had long roots in Anatolia. Currently, he was hanging on in Kütahya, commanding some of the very last Roman garrisons on the plateau. Unsurprisingly, he was furious with Emperor Michael for what he saw as basically ignoring the collapse of Roman Anatolia, where he and his family, incidentally, happened to hold great estates. And so, Votanyates gathered up what troops he could get his hands on, including some Turkish troops under the leadership of a renegade Seljuk prince named Artukids, and began marching towards Constantinople, a route that necessarily took him through Bithynia and Iznik, where Sulayman and Mansur had recently set themselves up. As Votanyates and his armies entered Bithynia in October 1077, they quickly came into contact with Seljuk forces sent out by Sulayman. Several small skirmishes took place. Sulayman and the Turks were clearly willing to fight for their new turf. It became readily apparent to Votanyates that the Turks controlled all the passes and roads through the region, roads that he would need to enter Iznik and then cross the mountains to get to the capital. So Votanyates sent off to Sulayman and Mansur as an emissary the Seljuk prince and his retinue, Artukids. And I'd note that it is quite interesting that even Votanyates, the man who wanted to drive the Turks out of Anatolia forever, was using Turkish troops and had Turks in his retinue. That is how quickly the Turks had implanted themselves into the Byzantine military and political system. But Artukids was not the only emissary that Sulayman and Mansur were hearing from, because Emperor Michael had heard of the approach of Votanyates and had reached out to the brothers at the same time. He, of course, wanted them to stop the advance of Votanyates. The emperor's emissary came bearing numerous gifts and promises of recognition and future alliance. So now, Sulayman and Mansur were in a perfect position. There were two claimants to the throne, both of whom wanted something from this fledgling beylik. Ultimately, they decided to go with Votanyates. Likely, the presence of the Seljuk prince Artukids among his retainers was a huge benefit to Votanyates. With the sons of Kutalmish clearing the way, Votanyates was able to enter Iznik as winter set in 1077. There, he prepared to march on Constantinople when the snows melted. And Sulayman and Mansur agreed to do more than just let Votanyates pass. They pledged to march with him, to attack Constantinople itself. But of course, the brothers demanded a great price for this aid. Votanyates, of course, promised to shower them with treasure when victory was attained. But it seems likely that Votanyates granted them something even more valuable, though it must have been granted with great reluctance. The right of these Seljuk princes and their men to reside in Iznik itself after the victory, to act as the protectors of Iznik and all of Bithynia. After all, Votanyates was going to need all of the troops he could get his hands on, including what remained of the Roman garrison here in Iznik. Maybe these brothers, Sulayman and Mansur, men he had been assured were noble princes of great lineage, could act as the protectors of these realms and as loyal servants of the Emperor of the Romans. Michael Attaliates writes of the scene that took place outside of Iznik when Sulayman and Mansur pledged their loyalty to Votanyates. For this reason, some of the noblemen of Persia came to Nicaea, that is Iznik. They were brothers in flesh and nature, and drew the name Kutalmish from their father's name and strove for the Sultan's title and power, opposing the chieftain of the Huns. Therefore, they fled to the land of the Romans to gain the support of a power rivaling him, what because of their royal descent they would have never accepted to do for any king of the Persians or the Romans, they unexpectedly showed to him. They bent their knee and declared that with much confidence they would lead the way of his march to the imperial city. And I would note how very different this is from the Seljuk propaganda, which depicts Sulayman as a loyal servant and agent of the great Seljuk Sultan. Attaliates, who was actually a contemporary, shows us the much more accurate picture of a great tension between the line of Kutalmish and the line of Chahri, a tension that is going to inform a lot of Sulayman's career going forward. But it's very interesting that he calls them Persian noblemen, raising them above being mere Turkish savages in the eyes of a Roman audience. And I think we see here a key strength of Sulayman that he would use as a valuable tool throughout his reign: his exalted lineage. He would use this to both establish his legitimacy with the Roman state and to browbeat his fellow beys into accepting his supremacy and ultimately his suzerainty. And in the act of bowing to Votaniates and performing the proper rituals of loyalty, Sulayman was also acting within the established role of a barbarian aiding a Roman empire. In short, he was starting to play Byzantine politics as the Byzantines would have expected, but of course, to his own ends. With Sulayman and Mansur at his side, Votaniates marched out of Iznik in the early spring of 1078. The combined Byzantine and Turkish army reached the Asian suburbs of Constantinople in March, camping in what is now Kadıköy and Üsküdar. The arrival of Votaniates is said to have been greeted with great joy by the people of the region, and indeed of the city, as the constant crisis since Manzikert had made Emperor Michael extremely unpopular. Facing a popular uprising in the city, and with Votaniates and his Turkish allies on the other side of the Bosphorus, Emperor Michael was forced to resign. Votaniates entered the city and was declared emperor, and he made sure to amply reward Sulayman and Mansur. Ataliates writes that the so-called Kutalmish Turks are recorded as having received some of the greatest prizes of victory, bags of gold and heaps of precious textiles, and he goes on to say that the two brothers received a daily and immeasurable stipend from the imperial treasuries, and for this reason the manifold sounds of trumpets and cheers could be heard from the army of the Turks at Chrysopolis, that is Üsküdar, on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. Sulayman and Mansur then returned back to Bithynia and appeared to have taken up residence in Iznik itself. This city would, of course, eventually be the first capital of the coming Sultanate of Rum. But for now, Sulayman was no sultan. He was a mere Turkish bey, a bey with a great lineage, of course, but with no more power than any of the other beys who were setting themselves up across Anatolia. And really, he was a co-bey with his brother Mansur. And like the other Turkish beys, he was basically doing this through cooperating with the local Byzantine elites. Indeed, he was a vassal of the emperor himself. Sulayman and Mansur soon had further opportunities to demonstrate their worth to their master in Constantinople, because another Byzantine general, coincidentally also named Nikephoros, had raised the flag of revolt at the same time as the now emperor Nikephoros Votaniates. The extremely talented Nikephoros Vrienios, the man who had commanded the left wing at Manzikert, went into rebellion in November 1077. Vrienios, now the Duke of Dyrrhachium, modern-day Durrës in Albania, now began marching west through the Balkans towards Constantinople. And so Emperor Votaniates sent urgent word to his most powerful vassals, Sulayman and Mansur. It was carried to the brothers by none other than the future emperor Alexios Komnenos. Ataliates relates, he sent messages to the Turkish chiefs who resided in Nicaea, that is Iznik. These were Masur and Sulayman, that is Mansur and Sulayman, the sons of Kutalmish, and they immediately sent allies, not fewer than 2,000, and swiftly prepared others. These Turkish forces proved to be absolutely critical at the Great Battle of Calavriae, at which Vrienios and his armies were defeated by Alexios. As the heavily outnumbered forces of Alexios Komnenos were about to be defeated by Vrienios, the Turks appeared from over the horizon. They arrived at the very last moment, and with a massive charge of steppe riders, the vaunted horse archers, they were able to turn the battle. As a result, Vrienios was captured and blinded, and Alexios was set upon the road that would lead to him becoming emperor himself. We don't know what material gifts Sulayman and Mansur received from Votaniates as a reward for saving the regime, but they must have been immense. But for our story, the most important thing to note is that by aiding the victorious side, this fledgling beylik in Iznik became both much more important in the Byzantine administrative and military apparatus and increasingly independent from its overlords in Constantinople. There are scattered references in the Byzantine sources that some historians believe may indicate that it was during this time that Sulayman and Mansur really began to become the preeminent Turkish leaders in western Anatolia, that the smaller and unnamed beys in the region began to recognize their supremacy. It also seems that it was around this time that Mansur died, though we don't know the details. Some historians say that it must have been as a result of a struggle with Sulayman over the control of the beylik. Indeed, one later Seljuk source says that Mansur entered into revolt, and Melik Shah himself sent a great army under a leader named Porsuk to aid Sulayman in destroying him. But this is not recorded in other sources, and it really does seem like propaganda to entrench Sulayman's rule by tying him to the great Seljuk Sultan and his court. We really can't know for sure, but the silence in most Islamic histories may be because they would rather omit what happened than record a story embarrassing to Sulayman. If I had to put money on it, I would bet that Sulayman found a way to finish his brother off. So long, Mansur. We barely knew you. Sulayman, now the sole ruler of his beylik, soon had another chance to play Byzantine politics and expand his power. Because in 1080, a mere 2 years after the revolt of Nikephoros Vrienios, yet another revolt erupted in chaos-stricken Byzantium. In the autumn of 1080, yet another Byzantine general revolted, Nikephoros Melissenos. Yes, a third Nikephoros. I know how annoying this is, which is why I've been sticking to last names here. Melissenos had been loyal to Emperor Michael, and after the victory of Votaniates, he had been packed off to the island of Kos, a Greek island visible from Bodrum. And in 1080, feeling that the Votaniates regime was wobbling, Melissenos escaped from Kos and began raising volunteers, mercenaries, and Turkish warriors in western Anatolia. He then began marching north towards Constantinople through the interior of Anatolia. Melissenos eventually came to Eskişehir, then called Dorylaeum, a short march away from Iznik. And it was during this usurpation of Melissenos that Byzantine historians first record many of the cities of western Anatolia falling to the Turks. Though falling isn't really the right word. The Turks didn't have siege engines. They couldn't really besiege fortified cities. Instead, the Turks were basically invited in by the local nobility to provide military muscle as general security collapsed. Furthermore, Melissenos was deeply reliant on Turkish warriors, which forced him to grant wide concessions to the Turkish beys. Sulayman, of course, jumped at the possibility and was happy to throw his alliance with Votaniates overboard in order to get a better deal from Melissenos. Indeed, according to the Byzantine sources, Melissenos basically handed over what was left of Roman rule in Anatolia to the Turks, and in particular to Sulayman. However, we should take that with a grain of salt, because all later Byzantine histories are pro-Alexios, and therefore have a vested interest in presenting this as the fault of Alexios' main rival. Indeed, some modern historians argue that the mass handover of the cities of western Anatolia to the Turks could very well be a product of Alexios' reign, and the Byzantine historians are just using Melissenos as a scapegoat. But while there is likely some truth in this, in that Turkish rule was cemented in Alexios' reign, there's at least one historian who is not entirely incentivized to be pro-Alexios. Vrienios the Younger, whose father had been blinded after his defeat at Alexios' hands, writes, "Thus it happened within a short time that the Turks took possession of all towns in Asia, Phrygia, and Galatia. And most modern historians believe that it was during Melisenos' uprising at the very latest that Sulayman cemented his control over Iznik itself, and his nascent beylik began establishing its control over the whole region. And so it was that during Melisenos' usurpation, the authority and independence of Sulayman's beylik in Iznik grew immeasurably. Melisenos likely turned over many of the towns around Iznik to this established beylik, the one ruled by a Turk with an established royal lineage, who was a known quantity to the Roman state and who was adept at playing Roman politics. Most likely, this included the city of Cyzicus on the Sea of Marmara, near modern-day Bandurma, which the sources record as being taken by the Turks at this time. Even Izmit, Nicomedia in Greek, the ancient and great city less than a day's march from the Asian suburbs of Constantinople, was taken by Sulayman. And furthermore, no doubt, many of the other Turkish bands moving into the cities of the region under Melisenos' watch were vassals of Sulayman. That said, doubtless, some were independent small beys who Sulayman would eventually have to bully into accepting his sovereignty. But overall, this Turkish ascendancy in the cities of western Anatolia seems to have overwhelmingly benefited Sulayman. His established beylik, with its superior lineage, and his prior recognition by the court in Constantinople, was optimally positioned. And it seems that it was now that he really took over the Roman administration of the region, levying taxes, distributing landed estates and tax fiefs, and dispensing justice. Indeed, Sulayman appears to have largely left in place the existing Roman administration and the administrators, basically taking over the Roman administration from the top down. This, then, is really the beginning of the Sultanate of Rum, the Turkish state that would tie together Turkish, Perso-Islamic, and Roman forms of government, melding them together to create a new Anatolian Turkish form of government. In response to this rebellion of Melisenos, Votaniates pleaded with Sulayman for aid and called upon Alexios Komnenos to yet again lead an army against a rebel general. Naturally, Votaniates' pleas to Sulayman for aid fell on deaf ears. Why would he help a doomed emperor while his rival was basically handing Anatolia over to him lock, stock, and barrel? And the pleas to Alexios turned out to be just as useless, because instead of coming to the aid of the emperor, Alexios spied his chance to gain the purple himself. He himself revolted in February 1081 in the Balkans, leaving Emperor Votaniates facing two great rebellions, Melisenos in the east and Alexios in the west. And there was simply no way he could survive this. Ultimately, it was of course Alexios Komnenos who would win this three-way struggle. Alexios began marching on the capital, while in Constantinople itself, his family and his faction were skillfully playing politics to ensure his proclamation as emperor. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here. I would really recommend the History of Byzantium podcast if you are interested. Regardless, the result is that Votaniates was overthrown in Constantinople. Alexios entered the capital in April 1081, mere weeks after raising the flag of revolt, and was declared emperor, inaugurating the celebrated Komnenian dynasty. But now, Emperor Alexios had to figure out how to deal with Melisenos. And he also had bigger problems to worry about, as the Norman Robert Guiscard was preparing to invade the empire from Italy. And so, Alexios offered Melisenos titles and estates in Thrace to get him to give up on his revolt in Anatolia. Quite happy with this, Melisenos decamped to Europe. His greatest legacy likely being the handover of the administration of most of western Anatolia to the Turks, and in particular, Sulayman's nascent sultanate in Iznik. This left Alexios the question of what to do about Sulayman and the Turks. While the Byzantines were focused on the wars for the throne and fretting about the Norman invasions in the west, Sulayman had been busy. According to Anna, who might be exaggerating a little for effect, Sulayman had sent his raiders out across northwest Anatolia. They had taken Nicomedia, that is Izmit, and even raided Üsküdar, visible across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. Today, it is literally a single metro stop away. As they spread out across the region, they met no resistance and looted fortresses, churches, and estates. Though tellingly, they seem to have made no attempt to settle anywhere. And Vranios the Younger tells us that the superiority of the Turks as soldiers made Alexios unwilling to march against them, which again seems accurate. The Turks really were the super soldiers of the day, and no doubt Alexios was really not eager to fight them, especially given the threat of the Normans in the west. That said, Alexios did try to do something to at least strengthen his hands in the coming negotiation. Anna Komnena does record that her father launched several naval missions to, in essence, drive the Turks from any maritime possessions they held and to push them back onto the plateau itself. Though fittingly, she does exaggerate and play this up to make her father look good. Indeed, she suggests that it was only the approach of Robert Guiscard from the west that stopped her father from advancing further, which is at best extremely wishful thinking. Most likely, it seems that Alexios was able to stop the Turkish raiding of Üsküdar and the Asian suburbs of the capital, and to keep Turkish raiders away from the coastline through naval attacks. But the reality was that there was no driving Sulayman out of most of his new territory, and with the Normans approaching from the west, Emperor Alexios was forced to make peace with Sulayman on whatever terms he could. And so, in 1081, Sulayman and Emperor Alexios came to a peace treaty. According to Anna Komnena, under the terms of the treaty, Sulayman agreed to give up any control over and even cease raiding the coastlines of northwestern Anatolia, including Izmit, the Asian suburbs of Constantinople, and the areas around Bandurma and Bursa. Anna Komnena even says that he was driven from all of Bithynia, and that the river Drakon was set as the border between their realms. This is likely a small creek, today called Kırkçeçit Deresi, which flows into the Gulf of Izmit on its southern side. But this is clearly not true. Indeed, there's a lot of reasons to doubt Komnena's history on the details of this treaty. It does not quite line up with what we know happened based on other historians and later events. And Komnena is of course heavily incentivized to make the peace treaty forced on her father Alexios look as good as possible. It's part of her broader goal of justifying and exculpating her father. Instead, it seems that Sulayman kept the northern and southern shores of the Gulf of Izmit, including Izmit itself, and agreed to refrain only from raiding the Asian suburbs of Constantinople, withdrawing his forces back towards Izmit. In exchange, Sulayman received a massive tribute payment from the Roman Empire, which even Anna Komnena is forced to admit in a roundabout way. But most critically of all, this treaty recognized Sulayman not as a vassal of the court in Constantinople, but as an independent power, the lord of Iznik, and indeed most of Bithynia and Phrygia. And it was here, in signing this treaty, that Sulayman seems to have first used the title that would be borne by him and his descendants going forward: Sultan. No longer was he a mere bey among beys. He, the prince of the line of Kutalmish, was now claiming to be something more, to be an equal of the emperor of the Romans and superior to all other Turkish beys, to be the overlord of the Turks of Anatolia, the Sultan of Rum, the very first Roman Sultan. And next time, we will continue the story of the first Roman Sultan as he actually creates his sultanate, but also as he falls victim to the very audacity that enabled his stunning rise.